Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're dealing with a tough one. A 12-year-old convicted of first-degree murder.
Yeah, this is it's heavy stuff for sure.
Definitely. So we'll be looking at the sentencing hearing where the judge really had to grapple with some complex issues, trying to balance justice for the victim with the possibility of rehabilitation for a child who was failed by the system.
Right. It's a tough situation all around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our source material for this deep dive is a YouTube transcript from the Law and Crime Trials channel. The video is titled, Young Killer Speaks Before Getting Sentenced for Playground Murder.
So we're going to break down this courtroom hearing and see what factors the judge considered when sentencing a kid who committed this horrible act.
Exactly. And also trying to understand the circumstances that led him to that point.
Mm.
So let's just jump right in.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so the basics. We've got Jamarian Lorne, a 12-year-old boy who is convicted of stabbing and killing another child named Connor on a playground.
And like you said, the judge right from the start emphasizes just how serious this crime is. We're talking about first-degree murder, the most serious charge you can get.
Right, and the prosecution is obviously pushing for a harsh sentence. They point out that Jamarian admitted to planning this for a whole year. He even talked about a murder-suicide.
Yeah, they really highlight the premeditation aspect of it, trying to show that this wasn't some impulsive act.
But then Jamarian's defense attorney comes in, and they paint a very different picture.
They start talking about Jamarian's life and how he was a victim of horrific abuse and neglect, both from his parents and Dee's grandmother.
Okay, so we're talking physical abuse, we're talking neglect.
Yeah.
And there were even repeated reports to Child Protective Services, but nothing was done to help him.
Right, so the defense is basically arguing that the system that was supposed to protect Jamarian completely failed him.
And the judge actually acknowledges this, which is pretty remarkable.
He does. He actually states, it would be naive to conclude that his life experience had nothing to do with his scheme of killing someone so that he would be arrested and executed.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. So now the judge is faced with this incredibly difficult dilemma. How do you balance justice for Connor with the potential for rehabilitation for Jamarian, a child who was clearly failed by the system?
It's a tough one. And that's where a landmark Supreme Court case comes into play, Miller versus Alabama.
Okay, I vaguely remember hearing about this case, but remind me, how does it apply here?
Well, Miller versus Alabama established that children are fundamentally different from adults. They lack the maturity, the impulse control, and the ability to escape harmful environments that adults have.
Okay, that makes sense. Their brains aren't fully developed yet, so they don't always think through the consequences of their actions.
Exactly. So you can't hold them to the same level of responsibility as adults because their brains literally work differently.
So that means that Jamarian's age and his incredibly difficult background become huge factors in his sentencing.
Absolutely. And you can really hear the judge wrestling with this in his statements. He says, it is a tragedy all the way around. A 12-year-old child brutally murdered at random. And the 12-year-old killer who did not choose to be raised in an abusive and neglectful home.
That's just heartbreaking. So what did the judge ultimately decide?
Well, he went with what's called a blended sentence. This basically means that Jamarian is sent to a specialized juvenile facility that focuses on rehabilitation, but there's a possibility of a prison sentence later on.
So there's accountability, but also a chance for him to maybe turn his life around.
Right. It's a way to acknowledge the seriousness of the crime, but also to recognize that Jamarian is still a child with the potential for change.
Now, we also need to talk about Connor's family. Their victim impact statements were incredibly powerful and really heartbreaking.
Absolutely. They give a voice to the profound loss and suffering caused by Jamarian's actions and remind us of the very real consequences of this crime.
For example, Connor's mother, Danielle, talks about how Connor's death deeply affected his brother's grades. He was a straight-A student before all of this happened.
She also talks about how she's also a survivor of abuse, and the therapy for her surviving son is a huge financial burden. You can just hear the pain in her voice.
It really highlights the ripple effect of this tragedy, how it goes far beyond just the immediate victim.
Exactly. And then there's Cameron Connor's brother, who talks about how hard it is to make new friends now and how he's constantly reminded of his brother's absence.
He also shares some of his favorite memories of Connor, like building a treehouse together and playing video games.
It's those little details that really get to you. You can just hear the innocence stolen from him.
And then Connor's father, Jared, talks about holding his dying son in his arms and the trauma that his other sons witnessed.
He talks about constantly replaying that day in his mind and the feeling of helplessness.
The judge also acknowledges this profound grief, saying that Connor's family is in the grip of the ugly hand of grief. It's a powerful image.
It really is. So we have this incredibly complex situation, a horrific crime, a child who was failed by the system, and a grieving family left to pick up the pieces.
And the judge has to try to make sense of it all, to find some kind of justice and balance in all of this tragedy.
It's a lot to unpack, and we're just scratching the surface here.
We still need to look into the specifics of the sentence that was imposed and what kind of programs are available for Jamarian.
And we also need to delve deeper into some of the arguments made by both the prosecution and the defense.
So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into this incredibly complex and heart-wrenching case.
Definitely. There's a lot more to discuss. You know, something that really stuck out to me was how the prosecution initially wanted life without parole for Jamarian.
Yeah, that's intense for a 12-year-old, even with such a serious crime.
It definitely shows you how seriously they take these kinds of cases, but in the end, they agreed to hold off on that and see how he does in the juvenile system.
So it seems like there's a bit of a shift happening, recognizing that maybe there's more to it than just punishment.
Right. It's like they're starting to understand that juvenile offenders are different and that rehabilitation could be a real possibility.
Okay, so another thing that I found interesting was how the defense really challenged the idea of Jamarian actually planning this crime.
Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. He did admit to thinking about it for a year.
Exactly. But the defense argued that just because he said the word planning doesn't automatically mean it was some super complex and detailed scheme.
Right. They said there wasn't enough solid evidence to actually prove that level of planning.
It just goes to show you how powerful words can be in a courtroom, right? Like how you interpret them can really affect the outcome.
Oh, absolutely. And to back up their argument, the defense brought up how Jamarian tried to get help before the crime even happened.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah.
He told people about the abuse and even tried to get counseling.
So he was reaching out for help, but it seems like no one was listening. It makes you wonder if the adults in his life could have done more. Should they have seen the warning signs?
Right. It makes you think about all the missed opportunities to intervene.
And that brings us back to what the judge said about the systemic failures. It's like a whole chain of events that led up to this.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
Now, the defense also made a point of saying that Jamarian had no prior criminal record.
Yeah, and they argued that should hold a lot of weight when considering a juvenile disposition.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
First offense, especially for a kid who's been through so much, shouldn't automatically define their whole life.
Exactly. There has to be room for growth and rehabilitation.
Okay, so then there was a whole debate about the programs available in the juvenile system versus the adult system.
Right. It's not just about the punishment itself, but what happens after sentencing. What kind of support will Jamarian get?
Right, will he have access to therapy, education, a structured environment?
Exactly. Those are the things that can actually help with rehabilitation and reintegration back into society.
And sending a kid like Jamarian to an adult prison just seems like setting him up for failure.
You have to wonder if that's truly beneficial for anyone involved.
Now, can we talk about Judith Reskovich's testimony for a second? What she said about Jamarian's transformation in detention was pretty remarkable.
I know. It's hard to imagine the kid who committed this crime as being enthusiastic, friendly, and fun. But that's exactly how the youth specialist described him.
It's like detention with its structure and consistent care actually gave him something he never had at home: stability.
And that stability allowed him to start healing and growing. Her argument for a juvenile sentence was really powerful.
It definitely gave me a sense of hope, but then you remember Connor and his family, and it's just so sad.
It's a constant back and forth, isn't it? Wanting justice for Connor, but also recognizing that Jamarian is a child who needs a chance at redemption. And I think the judge really captured that struggle in his words. When he said, "It would be naive to conclude that his life experience had nothing to do with his scheme of killing someone so that he would be arrested and executed," it just highlighted the whole complexity of the situation.
It's like he was saying that you can't ignore the impact of abuse and neglect in Jamarian's life.
Right, those things have serious consequences. And his decision to go with a blended sentence shows how much he considered all these factors.
It seems like he's trying to balance punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation, which is a really tough thing to do.
It is, and it really reflects this shift in how we're starting to approach juvenile justice.
It's not just about being tough on crime anymore. It's about understanding the root causes and trying to break the cycle.
And this whole case really highlights just how complex the justice system is, especially when you're dealing with young offenders who have experienced trauma.
It makes you question what true justice actually means.
It's about holding people accountable, but also recognizing that rehabilitation is possible, and sometimes it's really necessary, especially for children.
This episode has been so emotionally draining, but also so eye-opening.
It really sticks with you.
It makes you think about all the choices we make and the consequences of those choices and the responsibility we all have to protect children.
It's about recognizing that hurt people, and that children who experience violence are more likely to continue that cycle.
But it's also about believing in the possibility of change, in the power of rehabilitation, and in the resilience of the human spirit.
Because even in the darkest of times, there can still be hope.
And that's what we have to hold on to. The hope that Jamarian can heal, that Connor's family can find some peace, and that we can learn from this and work towards a better future where these kinds of stories become less and less common.
This deep dive has been tough, but also a really profound learning experience.
It's a story that will stay with us for sure, and we hope that it sparks some important conversations and inspires action.
It really makes you think about what we can do to stop these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
Yeah, like how can we prevent this from happening to other kids?
It all comes down to recognizing the signs of abuse and neglect and being willing to step in and do something.
So it's about creating a real safety net that catches these kids who are falling through the cracks.
Exactly. We need to support families that are struggling, provide resources for mental health and addiction, and make sure Child Protective Services has what they need to actually do their job.
Because if we can break the cycle of abuse early on, maybe we can prevent these horrible crimes from happening in the first place.
This case really shows us that violence doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's often the result of trauma and neglect.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Right. And kids who experience violence are more likely to repeat that violence themselves.
But we also need to remember that people can change. We have to believe in the possibility of rehabilitation.
And in the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of so much darkness, there can still be hope.
And that's what we have to focus on. The hope that Jamarian can find healing, that Connor's family can find some peace, and that we can all learn from this and work towards a better future.
A future where these kinds of stories are less and less common.
This deep dive has been incredibly tough, emotionally, but it's also been a really important learning experience.
It's a story that will stay with us, and we hope it starts some meaningful conversations and leads to real action.
Thank you for listening to Justice for the Souls podcast.